Have you ever read The Priory of the Orange Tree?
No, I don't think so.
One of the main characters is named Sabryn, and she's
Oh,
a total queer badass, so you need to read it. It's really
love
good.
it. I've never seen a character with my name besides like the Celtic legend, so I'm like excited.
Like made me that much more excited to interview you because you have the same name. I was like, okay.
What's your story? What's your sign? It's like we're twin flames in a different light.
Welcome to the Queer in Alberta TikTok kind of interview series. My name is Kelsey. I'm a Master's of Cultural Anthropology student here in Lethbridge. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a Filipina Canadian that identifies as queer.
I'm Sabryn. My pronouns are she, her. I go to MacEwan University. I'm an English major with a creative writing minor. Kind of identify as sapphic/queer. I kind of use the two interchangeably.
I noticed that in your form that you sent me that you used the term sapphic, and I just loved that so much. There's so much like, I don't know, a special like epic energy to the term sapphic.
Yeah, I identified as bisexual when I first came out and everything, and that was kind of how I felt for a very long time. And then recently I was like, oh, I don't think I really gel with that anymore. And I just feel like sapphic is like, it just, it's a pretty word and it gets the point across.
It really is. And like, I've had this conversation many times throughout these interviews about like labels and what you feel comfortable with. So I personally enjoy the term sapphic far more than I do say lesbian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So really, we can just start this off pretty easy. If you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit about your coming out story.
It's so funny because like I never feel like my story is overtly interesting, but
I promise.
I grew up in a Catholic school, Irish Catholic family, so it was like we didn't talk about gay and it was like a no thing. I just kind of realized when I was fairly young that like I was always like looking at girls more than I was looking at men. Like I remember looking at like Jessica Rabbit from like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and being
so
like
specific, but yes.
And I remember like I couldn't figure out if I wanted to be her or if I wanted to date her. Like I didn't know. I still don't know. Yeah, and I think like I knew something was different. Like I knew something was off, but I didn't quite know what it was for like a very, very long time. And it was such a heteronormative environment I was in. It was the environment where you marry a man when you're like 25 and you have kids.
Yeah.
And you're a wife and you're a mother, and that's really all you are. And that's the extent of what a woman is. I think the first time I realized that like something was like really different and was like, oh, there's something else going on here was when I was maybe 13 or 12. And my best friend at the time got a boyfriend. And I remember sobbing uncontrollably. And I was just like so heartbroken. And my mom was like, do you like the boy? And I'm like, no, I don't like him. What are you talking about? Obviously, I had a crush on my friend, but like I did not realize that at the time. Yeah. And that's kind of when I was like, oh, there's something else going on here. Honestly, just being a part of like online spaces and like artistic spaces is what kind of let me even know that this was like a world that people were like involved in. Like I had a really close friend at the time who had come out as gay, and that was like a huge thing because that was like the first time I knew like a gay person. I was like, oh my god. Wow. And all throughout high school I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell any of my family. I was like not doing anything about it. I didn't date in high school. I was like, no, I just I avoided everything romantic. Yeah. And then after high school, I got to a point and everyone was like asking like, when are you gonna meet a boy and all of that? And I got to a point where I was just like, all right, I should like inform people that this is like a thing that's happening. St. Albert is very Catholic based. Yeah. It's very like every corner is like, we have a church, like how other places have like a Starbucks, we have a church.
Exactly.
And especially smaller communities in Alberta, you feel like you're very much the only one who like feels a certain way or presents a certain way. I don't know, I think I was always like hyper aware of what was going on.
We both grew up in sounds like kind of small town, really religious kind of conservative communities. And sometimes that's an experience that not everybody gets, right? Like, especially if they're from like Calgary or Edmonton or bigger cities where things are a little more chill. So this is like something that I think is a really important conversation to have. But the thing that really stuck out to me is it sounds like you yourself were aware of your queerness. You just weren't at a point where you wanted to share it. And with me, I was like so in denial about my queerness that I didn't get it until I was like 17 and then like moved away to university and still tried to be straight kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that you kind of had that acceptance piece where I was in like full on religious denial.
Yeah. I think I was aware of it, but at the same time, I was so just like, my way of dealing with it was just like, oh, I'm never going to date. That was kind of like my stick it to the man of like doing it. It was just like, well, if I don't feel this way, then I'm not going to feel any way about anyone. And like, that is clearly not true. I have a wonderful partner girlfriend now. You know, at the time it was just like, I'm just never going to do any of that stuff. And that's how I'm going to deal with it. It was 1 to 100. I'm just not going to deal with anything. I'm just going to avoid it. Even though I know this is a thing, I'm just going to like actively be like, we're good. You know, head down, not looking at it.
And can I ask, like, what was the turning point where you decided to look at it and to kind of embrace it?
Yeah, I think for me, I was always very involved in like the artistic scene. I'm a writer, I'm a poet, I've been published in a couple things. So always had that like outlet. Before I even knew what was going on, I was writing about girls and stuff like that. I just didn't know I was. There was a point when I was like writing stuff and like talking to friends and they were all having experiences with boyfriends. I was just like, if I just keep avoiding this, it's gonna like tank my mental health so much more, because like what I was writing about was getting very sad and very dark because I was hiding such a huge part of myself. I felt like just such like nothing else in my life would make sense until this part of me made sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was just like struggling with that, because it's like you can't move forward until I accepted that part and like was open about it and was loud about it. And that's when like my mental health started to like improve, because I was like, oh, I'm not having to like shelter away from everything that I think about.
Yeah, just that freedom to kind of breathe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just so powerful. Everybody kind of has their defining moment, it seems, in these interviews, and it's always like a really big, meaningful moment that's always going to stay with you. But it's really, I think, something extra special when you come from an environment that you don't see yourself, right? And you don't know that it's okay for you to feel what you feel and all those sorts of things. Does that kind of land for you?
Yeah, for sure. Like growing up Irish Catholic, it's not at all something that you see. And like I think I heard about a gay cousin once, like in major passing, and then like we never talked about him again. I don't even know if he exists or what happened to him.
You want to talk about Bruno?
Yeah, exactly. We don't talk about him. I don't know where he is or what happened. And the first time I heard the term like gay was watching an episode of Friends with my dad.
Go off.
You can tell when you're like a 90s, early 2000 kid.
Same thing, different font. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an episode where Phoebe had like a husband who thought he was gay and then he had to divorce. Yes. And I remember asking my dad, being like, what does gay mean? Like, I had no idea. I was like a tiny little child. He was like, oh, I'll explain it to you when you're older. Okay. And now it's like, the first time I was like, oh, this is something that like adults talk about. Like, we don't talk about it as like kids. Like, that's a no topic. My dad's wonderful with my coming out journey. Like, he's said like he knew before I did. He's like, yeah, I knew when you were like 12. I was like, cool. But it was like the first time where I was like, oh, there might be like a level of like shame involved in this type of stuff. Like, even though I grew up Catholic and everything, it was such a thing we didn't even talk about. I didn't know if it was even shameful, because it was just like a non-entity in my life. Wow. And it was like this time where it was like, oh, we don't talk about it. It's like this thing where like kids aren't supposed to know about this, which is insane. So I wish I had known about it. Might have made things for me a bit easier.
Right? And that's like, I think, segues really nicely into our next question, because it's about representation, right? So like, did you find, kind of guess what your answer is going to be based on what you've shared with me already, but did you find that you had any representation growing up of queerness or something that you could see yourself in?
Not really. I mean, and when I did have it, it was like the brunt of a joke. It was like the thing where it was like, haha, she's a lesbian. And I was like, okay. You know, it was always like that funny comic relief character kind of, or like the overtly butch presenting person. And I was like, I didn't respond to that, because very much I'm very much more feminine leaning and all of that. And so I just didn't feel like I had any of that, even though there were obviously characters that looked like me, but none of them, like, I don't know, like had any of the same personality or the same things. My older sister, she had like, you know, she's the classic blonde, straight white girl, and she sees everyone in her. And it was one of those things where it was like, you know, she'd freak out over like the bad boy, good girl romance. And I was like, this just seems terrible.
Yeah, it's toxic. This seems not what I want. It's actually kind of crazy because in this conversation, as you were just speaking, you made me remember something about a language and power that I hadn't even thought about for years. And I think one of the first times that I ever kind of, you know, became aware of the term gay was in the phrase, "That's so gay," on the playground by kids, you know, and immediately the connotation there is a negative one. And so I may not have known what that was or that I would identify as such someday, but right away it was kind of set up to be this like negative, embarrassing, make fun of thing, or really furthermore sinful thing.
Yeah, for sure. That was like a insult that people threw around to like me when I was a kid.
Really?
And like, even though I wasn't aware of what was happening, but I was always like way closer to females just naturally. And it was always that thing of like, I didn't even want to be around the boys. I was like, I don't like you. When I was very young, I would have people calling me like the slurs like dyke and stuff like that. And I was just like, I didn't even know what that meant. I just knew it was like a bad thing. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, okay. I don't know what's happening here. I'm 8. I don't know why this is a thing. Right? It was like the brunt of a joke.
I'm sorry that happened to you because it doesn't make any sense either. Like, why would you be targeted with these things being weaponized in this specific context and way as a child? Like, it really, I think, speaks to, you know, kids are really just reproductions of what their parents say at home, right? And how their parents think. So I actually just did an interview with a educator in Edmonton recently, and they were telling me about how kids these days like are so on it with pronouns and they're so on it with like acceptance. And so when you look at how that's not even that long ago from when you and I were growing up to today, it makes me feel really hopeful looking at this next generation.
Yeah, well, my sister is a teacher as well now, and she has had kids in elementary schools come up to her and come out, and like she's the first person that they've come out to, and she's like, I'm so like, oh my god, this little girl came out to me as bisexual, and the girl's in like 5th grade, and I'm like, I did not have that type of awareness when I was in 5th grade. She talks about gay people in her class, and she has rainbows and all of that stuff, and works in a very small conservative, like even more small, like it's called Gibbons. It's like a farm town. Yeah, there's nothing going on in Gibbons. And it's very conservative out there, and so she has kids come in and be like, I don't think we're supposed to be talking about that and all of that, and that's what their parents are saying at home. And then she has some kids that are just like, yeah, it's cool, but they're the more liberal leaning parents. And then you got the farmer parents that are just like, no, we don't talk about it, it's a bad thing.
I can imagine that, you know, talking about queer issues, it's so important that your sister does that, but it would be challenging in an environment like that for sure, where you have those really strict social cues and norms. But speaking of your sister, sounds like she's very accepting of like you if she's talking about like queer rights and etc. in class.
My sister and my dad are both great. As soon as I came out to both of them in car rides. I don't know why everyone comes out in the car. I know so many people who do that. It's like, can't escape me if I do it here. I came out to both of them and they were just like, okay, cool, like whatever. And there's some people in my family that don't know just because safety issues. And then my mom, she knows, but I think she has a hard time with it.
My mom too.
She had like very specific idea of what my life was going to look like. And when I came out to her, I think I used the word, I think I'm bisexual. And she has clung on to the think since I've been 18. And even like a couple of months ago, she was like, are you still thinking that way? And I was like, yep. And like, I have my lovely partner, I have a non-binary partner now, and like, great. And I still haven't told my mom. Because I will eventually, but it's one of those things where it's hard because like we have had a very rocky relationship, so it's just such a weird thing to talk about. For her, it's okay if other people are gay, like she's gotten to that point, but like her kid can't be. My sister, if she doesn't date, it's fine because she's focusing on like school and work. I don't date, it's because I'm like not sure what I'm thinking about my sexuality, and I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure.
I don't use this term loosely, but it almost sounds like it's kind of like gaslighty behavior, because it's like that clinging to that potential, as you said, with like being bisexual. When you told your mom that, it really kind of just devalues the fact that you do like women, because she's just clinging so hard into that maybe for men. And that could be really exhausting. And I speak and say that even just relating from my own experience with my mom. Like, I came out as gay to her, but she still brings up like men in my life and etc. that she's like, we really like him, you should go on a date with him. And I'm like, you know this. We went through this in like 2017. We don't need to go through it again. It sounds like you came out a while ago, hey?
Like 2018, I think, around that time.
Yeah, so it was the same thing for me. Like, sometimes it can be kind of like a feeling of being the only one that goes through something like this, where it's like your parent accepts it but doesn't, and takes like such a long time to make even the smallest steps forward.
It's very strange, because like these people who are supposed to be like ultimately accepting of you, like no matter what, and you feel that disconnect of like, there's this one thing that just doesn't work, and I'm 22, almost 23, and I'm old enough where I'm just like, all right, cool. But when I was like 17, that was devastating. I just wanted like someone to tell me that it was going to be okay.
My heart just goes out to you, because I was you at 17. I was you at 18. I know what that feels like. If I have children, I never want my child to feel like they might lose my love for being authentically themselves, or be afraid to like tell me something like that. I think it gives a really big shift for us if we were ever to be parents.
I don't know if I ever want to be a mom or anything like that, or go through birthing.
That's God.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's my exact response. Like, it's adoption so only. But like my sister very much wants to be a mother, and so I know I'm gonna be an aunt one day. She's like, if my kid, is gay, she's like, I know that they're probably gonna go to you first, and they're not gonna go to their mom. And I'm like, because I get it in a different way than you ever will. Like, even having like a gay sister, it's not the same. When like young gay people come up to you and they just want to talk, it's like, oh my God, okay, whatever you need. Like, I didn't have like elder gays in my life, especially in Alberta. They look at me now, I'm just like, yes, whatever you need, whatever you want to talk about, I'll help, I'll be there. And it's just like, I want to be that space for that, what like I didn't have when I was like 13, and like God is judging me.
I feel the exact same way. Some of the comments I get are like from parents talking about how they live in like rural Saskatchewan, and they have like a kid that identifies as queer, and they're like, thank you for being a visible queer person for him. The way that makes me cry, like every single time. We did not have any representation when we were young in those exact shoes, so to be able to be that for somebody else is just like, whoof.
It's like one of the coolest things I think we get to do once you like are open with your queerness.
It's both like aging and coming into yourself, but it's openness, I think, is that key thing. Because I remember like being referred to as people's gay fairy godmother in the queer community with like my friends, because they were like struggling with their sexuality, and then they'd like talk to me about it just because I was an open queer person in Lethbridge. Once you start living your life freely and unabashedly, queer people notice and recognize that you're like a safe place to go to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you feel like growing up in Alberta specifically helps like impact, for better or worse, coming out as queer or gay?
It's a very conservative province. Like, I cried when like Jason Kenney got into office, because I was so devastated and I was so scared. It's very strange to be in a province where like that like the people who run it and the people who have like the loudest voices here don't care about your rights and don't care about you as a person. That makes it okay for other people to share those opinions and to also voice that. But you're just aware that like in this province in particular, it feels like no one else is like you, and it feels like everyone else has that more conservative nuclear family. All of it has that small town feel, unless you go to like the really, really big cities like Edmonton or Calgary. Everything else feels like a small suburban area, and it feels like everybody's in each other's business. And if you look a bit different, if you act a bit different, they clock you immediately on the street. You feel like everybody knows something about you before you do. I think people knew that there was something different about me, that there was something that wasn't 100% like true Albertan. It was just such a weird thing, because they automatically alienate you in this province if you're not like that.
I just remember like my high school self when you're talking about this, and like she tried so hard to conform to, even in terms of like femininity and dressing and who I dated, because I did have 2 boyfriends in high school. What a time, what a place, what an era. Like trying to play this role, this social role that was expected of me from my family, from my community, from being a woman in Alberta. And it just got to the point that I buckled underneath all of that pressure. And I knew that if I stayed in that environment, it was not going to be, you know, a successful story for me.
And I'm lucky because I have Edmonton very close to me now. Even with the family that don't know about me being sapphic or queer, I'm still playing a bit of a straight role. It's like there is like a switch that happens when you're going back and forth between you being like sapphic queer to straight, and it's like, this is not me whatsoever. This interview is probably how I'm coming out to the rest of the family, because I'm just gonna like post it on Facebook, be like, hey.
My goodness, I mean, let's take a second. My family, she's sapphic, she's queer, and she's epic. So let's cha-cha slide and move on. I'm just so privileged that you'd want to do that with me. Thank you.
Yeah, when I found out this was happening, and I'm like, all right, well, it's time to, you know, rip the Band-Aid off. Like, hi, I have a girlfriend.
Yes.
And I was like, shut up.
We're proud, and you have every right to live and express your identity in its full, beautiful capacity. So yeah, I'm just so privileged and happy that we get to do that together. That's so much fun. Yeah. I'm just totally just like sidetracked by that now. That's wicked. That's so good. But one thing that you were talking about that I thought was really interesting is in anthropology, and we take this from linguistics. Anthros like to take a lot of things from linguistics, but there's something called code switching. And you can think about this, say, like maybe if I'm speaking in English and then I switch into Tagalog, and your words and choices are different and you switch between the two. Kind of like that came to mind when you were speaking about kind of gender roles, you know, like straight roles with your family, even though that's not at all how you identify or how you would carry yourself in a different code. You kind of switch between the two.
Yeah, it's definitely something. Like even the slang I use around like my friends and like the family that does know, and like I use my hands to talk a lot. And I feel like that's kind of a queer thing. We all seem to do that. When I'm with my family, or the family that thinks I'm still straight, right, I'm not as, for lack of a better term, like flamboyant. I don't know, like I call people girl, I'm like, okay girl, go off, and like all of those things that you hear on TikTok and all that. And like when I'm around my family, it's like I speak like I'm from a Shakespearean novel. Like I'm like,
what art thou? Yeah.
I was talking to my therapist, and it was like, yeah, like there is queer Sabryn and then there's straight Sabryn. Yes. And they're 2 separate people, and changing the way you talk and the way you act. And for me, a big one was the way I dress. Mm-hmm. That was very different. When I was like fully straight, the way I dressed, way different than the way I dress now.
Yeah. So my father is Canadian and my mother is Filipina. And when we go see like my dad's side, they live in like the most rural Alberta. Okay. Like I think about if I grew up there, how crazy things would be. Like I would have been full on horse girl. I would have been like all of it, right? Our next question, it is, what would you like to tell other queer Albertans who might be struggling?
I knew you were going to ask something like this, and I've been trying to think of like a poetic answer, and I cannot
you're
think of anything. Yeah, I'm a poet, like that's what I do, and I got nothing. The number one thing would just be like, hold on. Like it feels like you're in a room and you're like screaming at the top of your lungs, and like everyone else is just like having a fun party, and you feel like no one else is paying attention to you, and you're like, hey, I have a problem, and no one does anything. Channel that once you're able to come out on the other side of it and be like, I'm pissed and here's why, and like make people listen to you. Like they might not be listening to you now, but like when you're in a position where you can be loud and you can take up space, take up as much space as you can. I very much made myself small when I was still in the closet. I was the quiet little girl. I know you feel like you have to put up with it now, and like maybe that's how you have to deal with it. Like people always say like, stick up for yourself. Sometimes you're in survival mode, and that's okay. And just know that one day you're going to be able to take that and you're going to be able to make something with it.
You said you're like, I'm poetic, but this isn't going to be poetic. And then it's going to be poetic. So thank you. The waterworks are here. When you talk about taking up space and like being loud and proud, I hope that younger Albertans or other Albertans watching this can kind of recognize that they're not the only one living this fight every day. And sometimes it's not a fight. Sometimes it's just showing up and looking better than everybody else in the room.
Exactly. Sometimes it's wearing colored eyeliner and
Yes.
doing things like that, being afraid and doing it anyway, which is like the hardest thing to do. The other day, my partner like motioned to hold their hand and like my brain just like broke. I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? We're in public. And there was like that moment of like the Irish Catholic girl came back and I was like, what? But we're like, no, my brain didn't understand what was happening. Obviously I got over it fairly quickly and my partner just kind of stared at me like I had 3 heads, but like it was one of those things where I think that part of you, it never quite leaves. I have a lot of Catholic guilt a lot of the time, and there is nothing like Irish Catholic guilt. It is an entire beast on its own.
I think like culturally, that's something that I can relate to too with Filipino culture.
Of course.
Filipino shame and Filipino guilt, all these sorts of things as well. Yeah.
And like I have a lot of weird queer guilt. There are so many people who weren't allowed to live proud the way I am. That has been like a huge like learning curve for me lately of just like, okay, I gotta learn some more queer history.
Recognizing and learning your history as a queer person is huge as a stepping stone, but also in understanding that they fought as hard as they did specifically so you could be free and live and not be burdened and face the hardships that they did.
No, and I do know that cognitively, like there's that part of my brain that knows like this is what they wanted. And I actually follow a woman on TikTok who is a trans woman who's lived a life back in like the 70s when she first came out as trans and was like living on the streets in Canada. She was like one of the pioneers. She knew people who were passing away from like the AIDS epidemic. Watching those videos and connecting to them, she's like, be proud about it, be loud, like be all these things. And like that's kind of helped me kind of be like, okay, there is like, you shouldn't feel guilty about it.
Specifically for queer history in Alberta, I don't know an extensive amount, but are you aware that I think it was in the 80s and 90s, the federal legislation that made it illegal to fire someone based on their sexuality came out of the U of A because a professor was fired for being gay?
I did not know that, no.
Like I did an interview with Shannon Phillips. She was our Minister of Environment and she's still the MLA for West Lethbridge. So I did an interview with her in my undergrad where I was just asking her about what an Albertan means to her. And she told me about this whole alternative history of Albertans that goes against this idea that it's just conservative and hay bale. We have had so many powerful things, social changes come out of this province because people, Albertans, stood up and said, this is unfair and this isn't right. And that's one that's really huge for the queer community.
That's amazing. And that, like, I struggle a lot with even like being proud to be Albertan. But like, there are those moments where you're like, we are strong people. Like, that's a very nice thing to know about that. Like, there are people in this province that like don't suck.
I have a couple notes from when you were speaking, and one of the notes that I have is grace for past conditioning, and it connects to when you were talking about queer guilt. When you were talking about wanting to hold your partner's hand and your previous self coming up for a second and being like, whoa, what's going on? Like, I hope that you don't beat yourself up about that or feel badly about that for that being a part of your experience, because it's sadly natural based on what we both went through growing up. Those views are always going to be there, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I've talked a little bit about my past relationships with women, but like I went through kind of a very toxic relationship. Have no ill will towards the person in case they see this, you're good. But I kind of lost my whole identity in that relationship. And I came out of it right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I was like, crap, who am I? What do I do? And then I had a year to sit there and figure it out. I never once saw any sapphic toxic relationships in media. I only ever saw like heterosexual toxic relationships. And so I had no idea what to look out for. When you do see women loving women in media, it's generally done in like a very like puppies and rainbows kind of way. They met when they're 16 and now they're together forever.
Yeah.
I'm like, I mean, when you're trying to figure out your sexuality with someone else, it's just a recipe for things to blow up. But that was like something I didn't see in media, and like I had no idea how to talk about it. Not saying like we want bad representation, but show representation of people who just like maybe aren't good together.
What my mind instantly goes to is when I was younger and going through my first like couple serious relationships, I didn't have a frame of reference for like what you're talking about, like how they should look, how they should go, when they're good versus when they're bad, when they're realistic versus idealized. I remember going out with a girl and she was being like pretty shitty. And then she literally sent me a Snapchat after she was at my house, not to expose her, but also I'm still kind of bitter about it. Like
as soon as you said Snapchat, it's over.
I know, right? Like she sent me a Snapchat that was not meant for me. And it was just, the caption was, yeah, but I don't think I really like her. And it was clearly about me. I texted her, I was like, what is this? And she told me, yeah, that's about you, all these sorts of things. And I remember distinctly having the thought to myself afterwards. I was like, I would never let a guy treat me like this. So why am I letting a woman treat me like this? And I think it's again that kind of like queer scarcity and representation and visibility, that it's like, do I have to put up with these things just because I'm in a woman loving woman relationship in this area and don't see how this could go differently?
When I was in my past relationship, the girl I was with, we were on a date, we went to the movies. At the movie, she like passes out asleep. So like she's asleep for like half the date. And it's just like has no idea what's going on, is completely out of it. If that was a man, I would have been like, bye. But because it is a queer relationship, you feel this like need to put up with it and like be okay with things that you're not okay with normally. As queer people, I feel like we go through like all of those first very later in life.
Yes.
Like my first like relationship, my first kiss, my first like all of that was like very much later in life than like a lot of my straight friends. We're kind of like 16-year-olds even though we're like 20. I think I just wanted to feel like I was catching up. Well, if I don't do this with a girl, then is anyone going to actually take me seriously? It's like a checklist that you have to have.
Catch up is such a good way to say it. And for me, it really brought up a lot of anxiety. I didn't have any sex ed in high school that taught me how to be intimate with a woman. So I was like, I need to lose my V card ASAP once I figured out that I was queer. Because I was like, I need to know how to do this and like so I can be confident and etc. Which of course is not a good way to kind of enter into that disaster. You spend so long suppressing your emotions and pretending to be something else or pretending that they're not there, that when you finally give yourself the liberty to get in touch with them, it's like a gay explosion. You're checking out every girl in a 50-mile radius because you didn't let yourself do that before.
There's a thing in therapy that we talk about in that, where like when you first let your emotions out, it like everything comes out like right up here. And then eventually after you've gotten used to taking out your emotions and everything, it comes back down and you're like kind of be at like a steady level. But like when you first do it, it's like everything all at once.
Coming out to someone like as soon as you meet them because you need them to know that you're gay. Whereas now I'm like, if I'm in conversation with somebody like, oh yeah, me and my ex-girlfriend, I went on a date with this girl. It's very much just a normal thing in conversation as it should be, rather than being like, here is my essay of why I am queer with all of my points that prove that I am actually queer.
You like show up with a PowerPoint.
Yes,
like
literally. Oh my God, one of the worst things. Like, it's so embarrassing now to think about, but it's so funny. When I did like start coming out in university, I had like a long ass Tumblr post about it. So I would like, instead of just going to my friends and being like, hi, I'm gay, I would pull out the Tumblr post and like read it to them. And this shit took like 10 minutes. Okay. It took a while. It went back to like the first girl I ever had a crush on and like justify.
I didn't have a Tumblr post, but I did have like a monologue that I would go through. I was just like, okay, listen, sit down, shut up. I have something to tell you. Like, it was like I was telling them I was dying. Like,
I know, it was the same thing with me. It was so dramatic.
Yeah, it was insane. And like, I don't know how I've ever dated anyone because like I'm insane.
The queer monologue is truly iconic in the origin story. And I'm so happy that you also relate to that, because what a niche specific experience.
That gay panic, all of it.
You know what? I went to school at the U of L and I was the only one from Bonnyville that had gone to Lethbridge. I was like, you know what? This is an opportunity for me to be whoever I want to be, fresh start, nobody knows me here. And I was like, a straight woman, how fun. I tried that for my first semester at school. And I remember in like my introduction to world religions course, there was a girl who's now like a friend of mine, which is really funny that it ended up working out this way. But I would like notice, I'd be like, she's not here today sitting in her usual spot. That's kind of sad. Or like she'd sit in front of me and I'd be like, hey, she has really nice long hair. It's really nice. I'm going to stare at it the entire class. I had no idea that, I had a crush on her, and then I figured it out, and it was like all these feelings of guilt and suppression and shame all over again before I finally figured out, you know what? We're just gay and that's okay. So yeah.
I went through that exact same thing with my current girlfriend. We met in a creative writing class,
This is sapphic.
It's very gay. Meeting her broke my brain. And like, I was like texting my friends like 2 days later, and I was like, I think I have a crush on this person. And like the day I asked for her number, I like planned a whole outfit. I painted my nails. I was like, nobody does it like women.
Amazing.
But yeah, and then it was just like 6 months of longing and just being friends. I'm like, do you like me yet? Finally, like in a car on the highway, she's like, I'm interested. And I can't tell you what happened because I blacked out for the rest of that conversation.
Appropriately so. I think that you'll appreciate this. I went to Pride in Calgary with my first girlfriend, and we were standing like really close to the start of the parade, and the parade was being opened that year by like, I can't remember the organization's exact name, but it was like Old Lesbian Grannies or something. Like that was like the name. So I'm like holding my girlfriend at the time, just like having an amazing time at Pride, and one of the first Pride festivals I've gone to. And this old lady looks at us and she makes direct eye contact with me, and she just mouths Happy Pride. And just that connection piece that you're talking about, like I didn't know her, she didn't know me, but in that moment we were experiencing something that we just innately understood for one another. And like she fought to live and have, you know, the rights that I have today. And in that moment, I kind of got to say thank you.
I have my own little Pride parade story. When I was maybe 14, something like that. My dad and I were driving past the Pride Parade in Edmonton. We were right next to the bisexual float, and I'm looking at them and like stars in my eyes, because like at that point I was like, oh my god, people who are like, they like people. And the guy who's on the float looks at me, and I think he could tell that like this is like a young gay. He's like dangling off of this float, and I'm like halfway out of the car just so we could like high five. And it was like such a small moment, but like the second we high five, and it's like our fingers barely touch, because like if I go any more out, I'm falling into the road. But like the people on the float, they all start cheering like so loud and like so proud, and they're just like, yeah, let's go. My dad was like swerving the car like into the thing to make sure I could like high five this man. And it was like such an insane experience, because that was like before I was even like out or anything. This moment of like genuine pure acceptance, whether or not I was bisexual or queer or straight, it didn't matter. It was just like, here's this little kid who just looks genuinely excited about this, little kid 14. It was just such a beautiful moment, and it was like one of the first things that like I always remember when I think about like being queer.
See, I'm on my period, so my emotions are already skyrocketing, but that is so sweet and special. And yeah, it's just like we might not know each other or have anything to do with each other ever again beyond this one moment that we share, but how special and meaningful, and it's gonna stay with you forever. Hey.
Yeah, it's very cool.
I think this one is my favorite question because it's specifically for you. So if you could go back in time and tell your younger self something as you are today, what would it be?
Oh boy. Genuinely, the first thing that's coming to my mind is stay alive. I went through a lot of my own mental health things because of queer, all of that. My life kind of imploded. One thing I learned in therapy was just blind acceptance. Sometimes it's gonna be like, okay, fine, that's what's happening, and you just have to move on. For me, I always say that art saved my life. Art for a queer person is like so important. I think it's the way we can express ourselves before we even know that we're like expressing ourselves. And like art can be a million different things. It can be writing, it can be painting, it can be music, it can be whatever you want it to be. Because I think it is like the ultimate way to express yourself and to feel safe in expressing yourself, because you never even have to show anyone it. For me, I was able to process a lot of my feelings being queer through writing. Like even if I was changing pronouns from like she, her to he, him, because I wasn't quite ready to talk about that yet. I think queer people all have a very distinct story to tell, even if you think it's the same story that like has been told a million times. Like that's something I think of all the time, because I'm like white religious girl. That is like, there's a million books written about that. Just put it down on paper and talk about it, or put it into words or art or painting. I think that's just like the number one thing I would tell people. It sounds cliche, but it does get better. I wish I could like show like little me that like, hey, you are openly sapphic, you have a partner who's wonderful, you have friends that genuinely do care about you, and like you're making strides with your career, and you're in school. You never thought you'd go to university, but you somehow pulled that off. nothing's ever going to be perfect. It's never going to be like a Disney fairy tale, but that's also kind of where the beauty comes in. I'm happy in my life, and that's something that like I never thought I would be able to say.
In high school, I very much felt that the world in front of me and the sadness and confusion and not feeling there was a place for me in that world, that was going to be like it for the long run. Just like you know, if I could go back and tell my younger self something, it's like this intense sadness and confusion and displacement of identity that you're feeling and don't understand is minuscule. It's not that long since I was 18, but that period of my life is such a small chapter of sadness. I think that is it for the interview. I just want to say thank you so much, and it was so lovely to get to connect with you.
Thank you so much. This was great. I was nervous coming into it because I had no idea what to expect, but you made this like a very easygoing experience.
Yeah, okay. I'm not gonna cry.
We live it like this.